Hi folks, in this video I'd like to talk about a concept called the central dogma. It's kind of an unusual phrase, but a dogma is sort of an established sort of set of rules or sets of information on some subject. And here what we're going to talk about is the central dogma of biochemistry or central dogma of molecular biology. And this was originally proposed by Francis Crick, one of the famous two individuals that actually determined the original structure of DNA. And this proposal came out in the mid-1960s and then ultimately has been sort of verified, hundreds of thousands of times that this is sort of the central way that the flow of information works. So what this really is describing is the flow of genetic info. And this central dogma basically applies to all living organisms here on our planet. Now, I'll just mention at the outset, even though I'll write this out as the, quote, central dogma, the overlying theory of how the flow of genetic information works, there are always some minor exceptions. We're going to focus mainly on the things that we know always exist. So if we wanted to draw out a simple diagram that described the flow of genetic information, we're going to start out with DNA. That can be converted to RNA, and then that can be converted to protein. So DNA acts as our central warehouse of genetic information, provides the blueprints for cells to figure out how to sort of run everything inside of a cell. And so let's just talk about the first part of the central dogma, and that is, we're going to draw an arrow like this. This is replication. So DNA has to be able to replicate itself so that copies of the parent's DNA can then be passed on to progeny down in further generations. This process of replication is performed by a special enzyme called DNA polymerase. So I'm going to put an enzyme name in one of these sort of cloud boxes just to indicate that it is a protein enzyme. And DNA polymerase is the enzyme that can copy DNA and basically make multiple copies in cells. So that's the first part of the central dogma, is that DNA has to be able to replicate. However, in order for information to be transmitted ultimately to proteins, which are going to be sort of the molecular machines that do all of the work of the cell, the information in the DNA is first transcribed into RNA. So we're going to put over this arrow transcription, which literally means to rewrite the message that's in DNA nucleotides or deoxynucleotides into ribonucleotides. And the main enzyme that does this is RNA polymerase. So it's going to read short sections of the DNA and convert that into these short, small pieces of RNA that can then go on to the next process. We'll talk about in other sections the main types of RNA. There's transfer RNA, tRNA. There's ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. And then the most important, which is called messenger RNA, or mRNA. OK, so once we have the message of DNA transcribed into RNA, the next step is the information in RNA is going to be translated into protein. OK, so we're going to call that process translation. And the main enzyme that does that is the ribosome. You can think of the ribosomes as essentially a molecular machine that can essentially read off these short pieces of messenger RNA, and in doing so, they're going to convert that into a protein product. And then finally, the proteins are what are actually going to go do the work of the cell. So these do work of cell. So we have enzymes. Okay, we have membrane proteins. There are going to be often receptor-type proteins, a whole host of other fibrous proteins, which would be the connective-type tissue proteins. So the proteins ultimately are the end product of this process. But when we look at proteins, ultimately the information that gave rise to those ultimately comes back to the DNA. And the DNA is really the central part of this central dogma. It's sort of the common thread of this whole process. And here on our small planet Earth, all organisms that we know of so far on our planet use this central dogma for the basic processes of life. Now, who knows what might happen on some other planet? There may be something similar or something totally different if there are, in fact, life forms. But at least here on our planet, this is the way that genetic information is replicated and then sent to future generations, or on a daily basis, how the DNA instructs our cells to actually do the daily work of the cell. All right, so that's the sort of overarching view of the central dogma. In later sections, we're going to talk a little bit more about the specific details of each of these processes. All right, I hope that helps. Have a good one.